We're here today with Dr. Laura Segafredo, and we're here at COP21. And Dr. Segafredo is the manager of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a United Nations initiative. And you're also one of the co-authors on the UNEP Emissions Gap Report. Mm-hmm. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we want to make sure we get a shot here because this will prove that we are outside Paris. This is where fashion meets science. This is amazing. So
thank you for that. Totally appreciate it. Thanks. You made my day.
Okay, good. All right. Well, we had the opportunity to speak earlier with Professor Dr. Nicholas Hoon, who's also one of your colleagues and one of the co-authors on the Emissions Gap Report. And our focus here really is on the gap. That's what we've been investigating for 2 years and through all the negotiations, at least for the past year, both in Bonn and now here outside Paris, at really how much time we have, the window that we have that's ever decreasing, where we really have the opportunity to take the actions necessary so that we can get to zero before we exhaust the emissions budget. All right, and so in our conversations earlier with Dr. Hoon, we kind of got it down to, because I'm trying to get it down to a way that's simple enough for the non-scientist to understand, but still has the kind of scientific accuracy and rigor.
Sure.
And the way that I understand it now is that the emissions budget that we have is somewhere around 1,000 gigatons.
Correct.
That's what's left. And that on the path that we're on, we will predictably exhaust that, use that up, deplete that in about 25 years. Is that accurate?
That's correct, yes.
So that's what I look at as the kind of the total window. But then, given that we're not headed in that direction, we're not headed in the direction of getting to zero before we deplete the budget, that there's a much smaller window, which I look at as a kind of a window of opportunity, that we have to reverse the trend that we're on in time that we can get to zero in the remaining amount of the total window. And what Dr. Hoon and others have told me, mostly off the record, is that their guesstimate of that window of opportunity is approximately 5 years. Would you agree?
I would agree. I would agree that, so first of all, it's very important to understand a couple of things. On current trajectories, it's true that we are going to exhaust this budget within the next 25 years, quarter of a century. However, there's already been a certain amount of actions that governments have taken to reduce that trajectory, so to bring it down a little. So essentially, every ton of CO2 or greenhouse gases in general that you don't emit today is going to leave you an extra ton like a year out into the future. So it's important that we essentially plateau and get these trajectories to come down as soon as possible. But once we get on this sort of decreasing trajectory, then we need to be at zero carbon somewhere in the second half of the century. Let's say somewhere around 2070 or so. Okay. However, this is also counterintuitive, by the way. This doesn't mean, like you said, that we have a lot of time to do this. It actually means that we need to start right away in order to be able to fit within that target and get to zero carbon in 2070. So it's just a little bit more nuanced than the 25 years that we have. Okay. If we just keep doing things the way that we are doing today, yes, we have 25 years, and then we can basically say we are sure that we're going to go way above the 2 degree limit, to the 2 degree increase in global average temperatures. We're going to be somewhere in between 4.5 and 6, and that's definitely a world that we don't want to live in, because that would be catastrophic in terms of the consequences for both for the environment, but most importantly for human beings. So yeah.
Yes, I think, there's an old George Carlin video, that the planet's going to be fine, right? It's just taking care of things by getting rid of us, and then it'll go back to, what it needs.
I use that line all the time. I think it's very important for people to understand we're not doing this to save the planet. The planet will be all right. It will be all right without us, or with a significantly smaller number of humans on it that have essentially destroyed all the services from nature that we rely on. And so that will be a challenge for survival for sure, but the planet itself will be there for another 5 billion years or so. So yeah, nothing's gonna take the planet, wipe it off the galaxy or something. It's really a matter of human survival.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in the GAP report, what it says is that we're currently at around 52 gigatons annual emissions, total emissions, which includes methane, carbon, all the gases, and that to get on a predictable trajectory toward not surpassing the 2 degrees, we need to be at 44 gigatons annual emissions in 2020.
Yes, that's right. And that number was going to go down even further in 2030, etc. And in fact, if we want to be on a 2-degree trajectory, it looks like we need to be around 10 gigatons in 2050. So that reduction, those 40-odd gigatons that we need to reduce between 2020 and 2050, that's the pathway to decarbonization, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then in the short term, in this 5-year window, it would seem that then we have to go from 52 currently, either to then increase and then come back that steeply to be at 44, or to start decreasing immediately. But how I see it is that there is essentially at least an 8 gigaton gap that has to be made up in the next 5 years. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely right. That's the conclusion of the emissions gap report, right? We have this gap. I think that the most current estimate is that it's going to be anywhere between 11, 12, and 13, 14 in 2030. So we're looking actually at an increasing gap as we move forward. So a couple of things. I think what's important to understand is that if we are not plateauing emissions soon, so within the next 5 years, we could still technically, potentially meet the 2-degree limit. However, the decrease, the trajectory will have to be so steep that it will be extremely expensive. So I think that the whole point is about how much do we want to, sacrifice for the good of climate, and I think that in that sense we might already be a little bit late. I think that if we had started being serious about it a few years back, we could have done this at essentially zero cost, and in fact with significant benefits associated to climate mitigation. But the more we wait, and the more this is going to be a cost. So I think that really it's kind of like a no-brainer. We should start as soon as possible because there's a lot of estimates that put the cost of essentially paying for the damages of climate at about $4. So for every dollar you spend in mitigation, you essentially save $4 in paying for natural disaster. So we still have a good window of opportunity for us to be on a positive sort of from the economic side to get a net benefit out of this, but that window is closing. And if I can just add, so the reason why it's important, so the project that I lead, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, we have an outlook at 2050. So we do scenarios of decarbonization in 2050. It's not yet net zero in 2050, but our idea is to put all these countries that participate in the project, we have about 16 right now, and we cover about 75% of emissions currently. The idea is to put the energy systems in these countries on a pathway to zero carbon in the second half of the century. And I think that what's important to keep in mind is that we can do a lot of things in the next 5 or 10 years that would reduce emissions by a little bit, let's say 20, 25%. But then would lock in a lot of carbon for the future. So it's important that we keep in mind that we need to get to zero within the next 50 years or so, because by having that as a long-term objective, we can actually really implement all these changes that we need to actually transition to cleaner energies. I mean, essentially we're saying, go all in on energy efficiency, decarbonize the power system, and switch fuels to wherever is possible to electricity, which will be decarbonized, or other low-carbon fuels. So we need to do all these 3 things. And if you're only thinking that you're going to get to your level of reductions in 2030 by switching from coal to gas, essentially like the US is doing, I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, but that is, sure, that's going to deliver emission reductions in 2030. However, those gas power plants will be around for 40 years, and replacing them after will be costly. And so why aren't we doing this right away? It just doesn't make any financial sense.
And then another aspect of this is that when we look at the next 5 years, the agreement that will supposedly be completed here on Friday doesn't go into effect for 5 years. Is that so? And I've even heard it spoken of. Well, the next 5 years is the interim period, which I just think is, I don't know, misunderstanding, misinformation, but I think it really puts the wrong message out here to people that look at all of this and we made all this progress, which is amazing. However, if it isn't sufficient to bridge the gap in time, that's what we need to be looking from the future of this, not from the past.
Exactly. So perhaps just a couple thoughts on the negotiations process. So number one is that I think that we have made tremendous progress. The fact that we have sort of made a step forward in terms of really having all countries come to the table and put on the table some level of commitment to emissions reductions, I think that that's great. However, there's a huge disconnect in the negotiations process between this sort of overall objective, which all the countries, all the parties agreed to, which is contain global warming within these 2 degrees Celsius limit, and the actual, and what needs to happen in order to hit that, target. It's not a target, it's a limit.
Yes,
so
yes.
we should try and stay below 2 degrees. So it's important to keep that in mind. So there's a huge disconnect there, and that's partly really what we are trying to help with, right, with these scenarios, and kind of like bring back everybody to like concrete actions that are necessary to stay within these safe limits for climate change.
If I could, because I know we've had this conversation, I had the opportunity before. I was at an engagement last night, and one of the speakers said that there's now a lot of talk of changing the target or the limit from 2 degrees to 1.5, that it's actually, but then I've also heard scientists say, well, that's, we're almost at 1 right now, and given how long the gas stays in the atmosphere, that even if we stopped immediately today, we've pretty much blown out the 1.5. Would you agree?
That is, I am not a climate scientist necessarily, but my understanding is that we have already, I think that what we already have locked into the atmosphere are 0.8 or 0.9 degrees Celsius so far, above pre-industrial era average temperatures. And with the emissions that we have already put into the atmosphere, because all these changes in temperature, by the way, are measured in 2100. So we need to look at that. So we already locked in another 0.6, 0.7. So yes, essentially 1.5, we already have change the atmosphere in a way that will already deliver 1.5 plus 1.5 degrees in 2100. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. The IPCC scenarios have looked at 1.5 degree scenarios. They rely a lot on negative emissions in the second half of the century. Now, the reality of that is that we just don't have the technology right now to basically suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I'm not really sure that that's very realistic. So I would tend to say that 1.5, and don't get me wrong, I welcome this focus on really staying below 2 degrees. I think I would read it as 2 degrees is an upper limit. Let's not lose sight of that, because when we talk about, but we can get to 2.7, then it kind of looks like we are almost there, but we are not almost there. We're still very far. So that's how I read this focus and this emphasis on 1.5. And the other, the sad thing is that even at 2 degrees, like I always say, 2 degrees doesn't mean that we're not going to face some consequences. And the reason why 1.5 is politically important is because there are a lot of countries in the world that face essentially extinction because they're going to go underwater if the temperature change is above 1.5 degrees. So there are serious reasons why I think we went back to talking about 1.5, but objectively, and I'm sorry to say that, again, that goes back to the idea of the disconnect between the negotiations and the actual world. It's out of reach already, so it's sad.
I think it's important that there be some sort of a campaign to let people know exactly what is happening, as you say, what the disconnect is, what the gap is, what really needs to happen in the short term, because every year we don't act, then the future becomes even more difficult.
Yes.
And that and more expensive. We are going to be just launching a global campaign over the next 5 years, the focus being to bridge the gap sufficiently that we have a real viable shot with the current technologies, without something that we're not quite sure about, but we hope happens in the future, to stay below that 2 degree limit. And I would love it if you would be part of that as an advisor, as you know, in terms of, because you actually have, you actually have a plan. You actually have worked it out. This is what we can do with current technology, with it, that it's economically viable. You have crossed the T's and dotted the I's, and it is right here to be able to be done. And the only thing standing in the way is the lack of a commitment to implementation. Would you agree?
I would certainly agree. So I think that that's really what's important about our project, is that we offer some possible pathways to a solution. And I'm not, I don't have the pretense to say that this is, oh, we've done the work, that's it, now just let's get going. Clearly, every country can have other options, and if they believe that some of the scenarios that we have outlined for each individual country are not good enough for them, or they don't like specific technology choices or things like that, they are welcome to try and do their own.
Yes.
But I think that what's really important is that we really focus on that objective, getting to what we need to do, getting to the transformation of the energy systems, the transformation of our economies that is necessary to stay within this climate limit. And by the way, like you said, I think that what's really interesting about our scenarios is that I really like to emphasize how we have managed to decouple economic growth from emissions, but we have actually, in our scenarios, outlined a world in which we have a 3-point-something% odd rate of GDP growth every year. I mean, the size of the global economy in our scenarios goes to 2.5 times what it is today, with carbon intensity of GDP reduced by 90%. So this is possible, and like you said, we did it all with existing technologies. Everything that we use in our report had to be out of the lab and ready to be implemented on the ground, but with clearly technologies that are not commercially viable today, because we have 35 years, 40 years to make them commercially viable. But this is essentially possible with what we know today. Some technologies need to improve. I'm thinking of CCS, for example. A lot of these scenarios rely on CCS. If we could do better than that, expanding renewables, and limiting really even more the amount of fossil fuels, that would be even better. So I think that.
And just for everyone, CCS is?
It's carbon capture and storage. So essentially it means you can still, so the only role for fossil fuels that is possible in a decarbonized world is if you essentially take the carbon out of the atmosphere after you burn those fossil fuels, or before, depending on the technology, but essentially you can't put any more carbon in the air, so that is the only way to do it. So the idea is that I would love to participate in your campaign. I think that it's important that also the government, civil society, everybody gets around this idea of how do we do this?
Yes.
I think it's so important. I'm tired of just talking about big things and not really, and kind of like losing sight of what needs to be done.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just really thank you for this. Thank you for taking the time and for being here with us. And is there anything else that you didn't get to say that you would want people to know?
No, I think I'm happy with everything I said. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.